David Martinez had been running on empty for months. The single father of two worked double shifts at the rail yard just outside of Phoenix. His calloused hands and weary eyes telling the story of a man who refused to give up despite the crushing weight of his circumstances. Every morning at 4:30 a.m., he'd kiss his sleeping daughter Emma goodbye and head out into the desert dawn. The fluorescent lights of the yard cutting through the darkness, like beacons of hope he could barely bring himself to believe in anymore. It had been 8 months since his world fell apart. 8 months since 3-year-old Miguel had vanished from their small apartment, while David was working a night shift and Emma was supposed to be watching her little brother. 8 months of police investigations that led nowhere, of sleepless nights spent walking the streets calling Miguel's name, of watching his 12-year-old daughter blame herself for something that wasn't her fault. The authorities had eventually shifted the case from active to cold. Though they never said those words directly to David, they didn't have to. He could see it in their eyes, hear it in the way their voices softened when they called with updates that weren't really updates at all. The rail yard had become David's sanctuary and his prison. The rhythm of the trains, the screech of metal on metal, the shouts of his co-workers, it all provided a numbing backdrop to thoughts he couldn't escape. His supervisor, Frank, had been understanding about the missed days in the beginning, but understanding had limits when schedules needed to be met and trains needed to run on time. David couldn't afford to lose this job. It was the only thing keeping a roof over Emma's head and food on their table. On this particular Tuesday morning, in late September, the desert air carried an unusual chill that made David pull his jacket tighter as he made his rounds. He was inspecting the eastbound tracks in Section 7, a stretch that ran parallel to the old highway before curving into the mountains. It was routine work checking for loose bolts, worn rails, anything that might cause a derailment. The sun was just beginning to paint the sky in shades of pink and orange when he heard it, a sound that made his blood freeze in his veins, the cry of a baby. David stopped walking, his heart hammering against his ribs. The desert played tricks, sometimes whined through the rocks, could sound like voices, and more than one rail worker had sworn they'd heard things that weren't there. But this was different. This was unmistakably the sound of an infant in distress. He followed the sound, his boots crunching on the gravel between the ties. 50 yards ahead, where the tracks curved around a massive boulder, he saw movement, something small and pale against the dark steel of the rails. David began to run. As he got closer, his mind struggled to process what he was seeing. A baby, maybe 18 months old, was crawling directly down the center of the tracks. The child was wearing only a diaper and a torn t-shirt, his skin dirty and scratched from the rough gravel. But it was when the baby looked up at David's approaching footsteps that the world seemed to tilt on its axis. The birthmark was unmistakable. A crescent-shaped mark on the left side of the child's forehead, dark brown against olive skin. David had kissed that birthmark every night for 3 years. He had traced it with his finger when Miguel was a newborn, had made up stories about how it was a moon that would always watch over him. Miguel, David whispered, then louder, Miguel. He scooped the baby up, his hands shaking as he held the small body against his chest. The child was thin to thin, and his eyes had a hollow look that spoke of hunger and fear. But those eyes, dark brown flecked with gold, were exactly the same. This was his son, his Miguel. The baby didn't recognize him at first, pulling away and whimpering. David's heart broke all over again as he realized how much his son had changed, how much trauma those little eyes had seen. But slowly, as David spoke in gentle Spanish the lullabies he used to sing, the pet names only he had ever used, something shifted in Miguel's expression. A flicker of recognition, then a small hand reaching up to touch David's face. Papa. The word was barely a whisper, scratchy from disuse, but it was the most beautiful sound David had ever heard. David collapsed to his knees beside the tracks, holding his son and sobbing. 8 months of grief and guilt and desperate hope poured out of him. As Miguel clung to his shirt with tiny fists, the baby was real. He was alive. He was here. But even as joy flooded through him, questions began to surface. How had Miguel gotten here? Where had he been all this time? And why? The thought made David's stomach clench. Why was he crawling alone on active train tracks? David pulled out his phone to call 911, but his hands were shaking so badly he could barely dial. When the dispatcher answered, the words tumbled out in a rush of English and Spanish, barely coherent through his tears. "My son, I found my son. He's been missing for 8 months. He's here on the train tracks. Please send help. The emergency." Response was swift. Within 20 minutes, the desert was filled with flashing lights and sirens. Paramedics, police officers, FBI agents who had been working Miguel's case, they all descended on the remote stretch of track where David sat holding his son, refusing to let go even as the EMTs tried to examine the boy. Detective Sarah Chen, who had been the lead investigator on Miguel's disappearance, knelt beside them. She was a small woman with kind eyes who had never stopped believing Miguel was alive, even when the evidence suggested otherwise. "David," she said gently, "we need to get Miguel to the hospital. He needs medical attention." David nodded, but his arms tightened around his son. "I can't lose him again," he whispered. "I can't. You won't," Detective Chen promised. "But right now, he needs help. Look at him, David. Look at his condition." It was true. Now that the initial shock was wearing off, David could see how malnourished Miguel was. His ribs showed through his thin skin, and there were bruises on his arms and legs that looked like finger marks. Someone had hurt his son. Someone had taken him and hurt him and left him to crawl on train tracks where he could have been killed. The rage that filled David was so intense it frightened him. But Miguel was watching his face with those wide, trusting eyes, and David forced himself to breathe. His son needed him to be strong now. At the hospital, Miguel was immediately taken into pediatric intensive care. David paced the waiting room like a caged animal, fielding calls from Emma, who was crying with joy and relief, from his mother, who had been praying novenas for Miguel's return every day for 8 months, from neighbors and friends who had seen the news reports that were already beginning to air. Dr. Patricia Summers, the pediatrician treating Miguel, found David in the waiting room 3 hours later. She was a middle-aged woman with graying hair and the kind of professional composure that couldn't quite hide her emotional investment in difficult cases. "Your son is going to be okay," she said, and David felt his knees nearly give out with relief. "He's severely malnourished and dehydrated, and there are signs of prolonged neglect. But physically, he's strong. Children are remarkably resilient. I see him, of course, but David, I need to prepare you. Miguel is going to need time to readjust. He's been through trauma that we can't fully understand yet. He may not remember things the way they were before. He may be afraid of things that used to be normal for him." David nodded. He had read about this during the long months of Miguel's absence, had prepared himself for the possibility that his son might be forever changed by whatever he had endured. Miguel was sleeping in a hospital bed that looked enormous around his small frame, for lines ran into his tiny arms and monitors beeped softly beside him. David pulled a chair close to the bed and took his son's hand, careful not to disturb the medical equipment. "I'm here, Mio," he whispered. "Papa's here now. You're safe." Over the next few days, as Miguel slowly regained his strength, fragments of his story began to emerge. He couldn't tell them much. He was still too young for detailed explanations, and the trauma had affected his ability to communicate. But through play therapy with child psychologists and careful questioning, a picture began to form. Miguel had been taken by a woman. He called her the lady with sad eyes. She had told him his daddy didn't want him anymore, that she was going to take care of him now. She had moved him frequently, never staying in one place for long. Sometimes there were other children, sometimes he was alone. The lady had gotten sick, Miguel said, and then she was gone. He had been left with a man who was mean, who didn't give him enough food, and who hurt him when he cried. The man had brought Miguel to the desert and left him there. Miguel had been walking and crawling for what must have been days, following the train tracks because they were the only straight line in a landscape of endless rocks and scrub. He had been looking for home, he told David through tears. He had been trying to find his way back to Papa. The investigation into Miguel's disappearance took on new urgency. The FBI was able to use the details Miguel provided to track down the man who had abandoned him in the desert. Carlos Vega, a drifter with a history of drug charges, was arrested in Tucson 3 days after Miguel was found. Under questioning, he led investigators to the body of Maria Santos, the woman who had initially taken Miguel. Maria had been a mentally ill woman who had lost her own son to DCFS years earlier. In her confused state, she had convinced herself that taking Miguel was some